attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone and welcome to the webcast. My name is Brittany Kaminsky. It is now 1 p.m. so we will begin our presentation shortly. Today on Friday, July 19th, we will have our presentation on getting back to business, addressing the needs of Rockaway businesses impacted by Superstorm Sandy, given by James Rausse, Hilary Papineau, Mandu, Erin, Thoresen, and Kevin Alexander. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box, and we will be able to answer those at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session. Here's a list of our sponsoring chapters, divisions, and universities. I would like to thank all of the participating chapters, divisions, and universities for making these webcasts possible, as well as the New York Metro chapter for sponsoring today's webcast. As you can see, we have a couple webcasts coming up for the next few months. To register for any of these upcoming webcasts, please visit www.utah-apa.org/webcast and register for your webcast of choice. You can also follow us on Twitter at Planning Webcast or like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on the Planning Webcast Series sponsored by chapters, divisions, and universities. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM, select today's date, which is Friday, July 19th, and then select today's webcast, Getting Back to Business, Addressing the Needs of Rockaway Businesses Impacted by Superstorm Sandy. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are also recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel later today. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. A PDF of the PowerPoint will be made available upon request. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is James Rausse. He currently serves as president of the American Planning Association New York Metro chapter. He has been responsible for leading the chapter's post-Sandy initiatives, which includes the content of today's webinar, organizing trainings in Staten Island, organizing events and reports with sister organizations such as AIA, ASLA, etc., and providing input and testimony to government agencies and New York elected officials. In his day job, James works as director of capital programs for Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz, Jr., where he has managed over $120 million in capital allocations that leverage billions of dollars in development for the borough, and is the primary point person for special land use and policy initiatives. Hilary Papineau is a certified urban planner with a specialization in urban policy and over 6 years of experience working as a research analyst in state and local government. Ms. Papineau currently works as a special assistant and research analyst for the New York City Comptroller's Office Audit Bureau, where she assists with the Bureau's risk assessment to help shape meaningful audits. In this role, Ms. Papineau manages public complaints and meets with a variety of advocacy groups on issues ranging from transportation and housing to parks and social services. Mandu is an urban planner and food activist. She has designed surveys, interviewed, and analyzed data for hundreds of businesses in different sectors and parts of the world. A passionate supporter of immigrant businesses, her graduate thesis focused on identifying ways to support South Asian food businesses originating in Queens. Ms. Sen has an undergraduate degree from Yale and a graduate degree from the Pratt Institute. Erin Thoresen is an urban planning professional with more than 6 years' experience in community planning, revitalization, and development in the not-for-profit sector. She is currently a senior program coordinator at Sustainable Long Island and works with communities throughout Nassau and Suffolk counties. Ms. Thoresen has extensive experience designing, coordinating, and facilitating community planning and engagement processes, and has led more than a dozen large-scale forums and planning sessions at local and regional levels. She regularly develops and conducts interviews, surveys, and interactive activities designed to help residents and businesses shape the future of their communities. A strong advocate for environmental, economic, and social sustainability, Ms. Thoresen has been working to strengthen the regional food system through professional and extracurricular projects. Kevin Alexander has served as the president and CEO of Rockaway Development and Revitalization Corporation since April 2006. His primary responsibilities include overall governance of the organization, identifying funding opportunities aligned with the needs of the Rockaways, and creating effective collaborations and partnerships focused on improving the quality of life for residents. Kevin's professional background includes over 10 years' experience as Chief Financial Officer of two prominent not-for-profit corporations, Harlem Congregations for Community Improvement and Harlem Dowling West Side Center for Children and Family Services. He possesses over 7 years of city government experience in the areas of financial management, strategic planning, and contract administration. Prior to leaving city government, he served as Deputy Agency's Chief Contracting Officer for the New York City Department of Human Resources Administration with administrative oversight of a contract and procurement portfolio of over 5,000 human services contracts valued in excess of $2.5 billion. So now I'm going to hand it over to our first presenter, who's going to be James Rausse.
Thank you, Brittany. And thank everyone for participating in this webinar. It's been an interesting last 9 or 10 months for the New York metropolitan area and New Jersey as well. We had a number of neighborhoods that were extremely devastated by the superstorm that hit our area. It was a unique combination of, a dissipating hurricane, a nor'easter, and high tide from a full moon. So when one of them started dying down, the other would step in and pick up the pace and just continually devastate a number of our communities, particularly along the Atlantic shore. When the storm hit, a lot of our planners went out and took the time and opportunity to do a lot of the initial cleanup and assistance efforts that were necessary in various neighborhoods. But a number of planners had come to the chapter asking for more medium and long-term opportunities to assist an affected community from a planning and community development standpoint. Back in early November, one of our Economic Development Committee members, Larissa Ortiz of Larissa Ortiz Associates, made a connection to Kevin Alexander of the Rockaway Development Revitalization Corporation, who are based in Far Rockaway, who saw a need to reopen the 1,100 businesses that RDRC, which is the acronym, represent throughout the Rockaways. At the time of the storm, immediately after the storm, over 90% of the businesses on the Rockaway Peninsula were devastated, shuttered, flooded, or subject to fire. What we had decided to do after speaking with Kevin regarding his needs was to undertake a 6-month planning effort to analyze how Superstorm Sandy impacted businesses on the peninsula and come up with opportunities to address the specific needs of the community, not only to reopen, but to think ahead, think more resilient, think how to engage additional strategies, its unique place along the Atlantic Ocean and as a barrier peninsula for much of the New York metropolitan area. So while doing that, we developed a relationship and we developed a strategy to go out and do a number of surveys for the area to properly assess the needs. Next slide. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go over, we have panelists here that are going to go over the scope of work that we did, the various areas, shelter and housing, food access, and transportation. Talk a little bit about the results from our research and survey outreach, and then go into the list of recommendations that we had submitted to RDRC in order to better help them identify partnerships and grant opportunities. And then we'll finish up with lessons learned and final thoughts in terms of moving forward. So the Rockaway Peninsula is located in Queens, one of the 5 boroughs in New York City. It's located, if you see, it's the peninsula at the bottom of the borough of Queens, along the other barrier islands of Long Island. It's the only part of New York City that's not contiguous to another landmass in New York City. It's actually connected to Nassau County. It's important to note because it's an approach and an attitude that many Rockaway residents feel the city has taken towards the peninsula over over its history is that it's this outlying area that doesn't get a lot of attention. Historically, the Rockaway Peninsula was a vacation destination point for many New Yorkers. Back before automobiles and airplanes, while the subway was being built and cars were just beginning to get introduced, many New York City residents used the Rockaways as well as places like Coney Island as their vacation spot, their weekend getaways. It was populated with a number of bungalows throughout the early to mid-20th century, almost exclusively all seasonal bungalows that didn't have the basic sewer systems or extensive plumbing systems that you would find in permanent homes. With the advent of the popularization of the automobile, the building of the highway system, and popularization of commercial airlines, the Rockaways fell by the wayside as a vacation destination, and over the next few decades saw a significant amount of devastation in that bungalows were abandoned, and as a result, whole communities were razed and left vacant and fallow for a number of decades. This coincided with the construction of a large number of high-rise buildings by Robert Moses that were a mix of public housing projects and senior housing. So while it's far from the center of Manhattan and other parts in New York City, you have a very dense population, particularly on the eastern end of the peninsula, that's challenged through either through impoverished housing conditions or through a frail and elderly. So throughout the rest of the peninsula, you see a diversity of housing stock and incomes. As I mentioned, over towards the east, Far Rockaway, Arverne, Edgemere area is where a lot of the high-rise housing is placed. As you get towards more west along the peninsula towards Roxbury, Neponsit, Rockaway Beach, and Breezy Point, it gets significantly more low-rise. And Breezy Point is where the major fire had occurred and is where you find a number of converted bungalows into permanent homes. The Rockaway Peninsula itself is 7 miles long, consisting of 13 neighborhoods that includes Broad Channel, which is the island mass in the middle of Jamaica Bay. Jamaica Bay is part of the Gateway National Recreation Area, which also includes land along the eastern shore of Staten Island and Sandy Hook in New Jersey. So the reason it's called the Gateway because it's the enter into the Narrows into the Hudson River and the Bay. It's situated less than 20 miles from Manhattan, but it's very difficult for many Rockaway residents to make it out and have transportation opportunities. So a little bit about what exists in the Rockaways. There are approximately 115,000 people who live on the Rockaways as per the last census. There are a diversity of incomes, although not extremely wide-ranging. There's very little extremely wealthy folks who live on the peninsula. So per capita income is approximately $21,000. It's currently about 35% white, 40% African American, and 20% Hispanic. Now, while on its face it seems like that the Rockaways is a very diverse community, but as I mentioned, it's 13 separate neighborhoods along the peninsula and 13 neighborhoods that rarely talk to each other. They are divided both by income and both by ethnicity. So in trying to coordinate out in the Rockaways, there were a significant number of barriers that we had faced in terms of just trying to do basic outreach and getting different groups and even different not-for-profits talking to each other. As a result, 36% of the area is on some form of public assistance, 6,000 are on cash assistance, 9,000 on SSI, and over 25,000 on Medicaid, which notes the elderly and senior population that live there. So one big issue with the Rockaways is that it's difficult to get from point A to point B on the Rockaways. There's a subway line that goes out the A train to the Rockaways that once it gets to the Rockaway Peninsula splits into two separate directions. But except immediately after Hurricane Sandy, you can't get across the peninsula by subway on one train. You have to go into, transfer a broad channel, and then come back out to go into to the other side of the peninsula. So it just kind of calls to the mindset of the disconnect along the peninsula. The per capita income, that we were talking about before is $5,000 less in Queens, $40,000 less in Manhattan. So significantly a middle and working class community. So to give you some context of what Sandy did to New York City and the area, October 29th, we saw the storm hit, and when most folks woke up on October 30th, they found a number of communities laid to waste. Caused over $19 billion in damages in New York City alone. Approximately 48 people died in New York State because of the storm, which in comparison, given the magnitude of the storm, we're just very thrilled it wasn't much greater because there was an opportunity given the high level of flooding and the number of people who died. I mean, the number of homes that burned down in places like Breezy Point or in Staten Island, that the damage wasn't much worse. Water levels rose over 10 feet due to the storm surge and the astronomical tide. In some spots, the tide was as high as 14 feet. In Breezy Point, the neighborhood that received the most press along the Rockaway Peninsula, 130 homes were lost due to fire damage in a very consolidated area. As I mentioned before, these were converted bungalows, and so homes are very close together. And so when the wind picked up, the fire just spread throughout the community. And the reason why we got involved, a number of businesses were forced to close their doors, and 4 or 5 months after the storm, still over 60% of the businesses along the Rockaway Peninsula were closed. This is significant in the sense in the work that we did with RDRC is because if you're talking about ways to be resilient, if you're talking about strategic ways to repopulate the area, you have to talk about basic goods and services. Where are people going to buy food? Where are people going to buy clothing? Where are you going to locate hospitals, which is a big issue there because Peninsula Hospital closed a few years prior. Where are you going to provide just basic access towards pharmacies and just sit-down restaurants and trying to best serve the community? If you don't have those resources there, what's the incentive for people to come back and consider investing in the neighborhood? Next slide. Can someone click on the next slide? I don't have access at the moment. Sorry, we seem to have technical difficulties here.
Erin, can you make sure your screen is not set to pause?
Yeah, it's not on pause.
It's just not advancing. Let's go ahead and See if that resets it. Erin, click on Show My Screen.
I can't seem to. It's just spinning.
Okay. Does anybody else have the presentation loaded on one of their computers?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, Hilary, I'm going to make you the presenter, and we'll just go off your screen.
Okay. All right, James, you should be all set.
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much. We apologize to anyone for the technical difficulties. Thank you for your patience. So just want to talk a little bit about RDRC, their background. They've been to CDC since Community Development Corporation since 1987. Their primary function is to provide business and community development services and support in employment readiness training, small business advice, managing commercial revitalization projects, but they also have some housing assistance primarily focused on foreclosure prevention, which is key for a community like the Rockaways, which, while there are a number of high-rise housing there, there are, as you saw with the demographic information, it's at least a third 1 to 2 family homes. So it's a challenged community. A lot of folks don't have insurance out there, so particularly after the storm, when they were looking to turn to someone, they realized that they didn't have flood insurance. They didn't, they were looking for opportunities to rebuild their homes, and RDRC is able to play a role in that. As I mentioned before, over 1,000 businesses were damaged in the corridor. RDRC immediately sprung into action. They've been working in the community for about 30 years, and worked with partnerships with other groups, Margaret Housing Corporation, Rockaway Waterfront Alliance, and as well as community and district leaders throughout the peninsula and the borough. So at this next slide. So I'm going to turn it over, but when addressing it, we formed 4 subcommittees to address the needs of the Rockaway Peninsula. One focused on shelter and housing for the reasons that I mentioned before. A number of homes were devastated by fire and flooding, as well as concern about foreclosure prevention, transportation need and access on the peninsula. Mentioned the A train before, bus service and Long Island Railroad service. Data support, which helped put together this presentation, maps and other data information, and food access and business outreach to address the lack of proper, healthy, and fresh foods on the peninsula, and just opportunities for business. So I'll turn it over to Hilary.
Great. Thanks, James, for giving all the context and background information to put this into context. So just to recap a little bit, the APA chapter, the New York Metro chapter, was working with RDRC. We initially had our first meeting. A small team of planners led by James met back in November, shortly after the storm, and took a tour of the Rockaways and some of the commercial areas and some of the hardest hit areas. And that's really what kind of kicked off the effort that our chapter undertook, which is about a 6-month planning effort. And I think as we go throughout this webinar, one of the interesting things was how our scope really focused on really the short-term immediate needs and developing recommendations to help alleviate these challenges in the long run. And a lot of the work really came down to the business aspect of our work. So out of that initial meeting back in November, touring the hard-hit communities is really how these really A, B, and C, the shelter, housing, transportation, and then D, food access and business, came as three kind of most critical areas that our teams could help address. And then the fourth team, the data and support, became more of an internal team that helped develop maps and other technical and visual aids. So I'm going to go through these in more detail, and then after I finish describing these four subgroups, I'm going to pass the torch over to Mandu, who's going to really hone in on the business outreach that we did and the interviews with the business community, as that became really one of the largest, the main scope of our work. So starting with shelter and housing. So the subcommittee on shelter and housing was really focused on foreclosure prevention, especially, as James mentioned, insurance issues were going to be pretty significant with insurance rates going up. And so possible buyout programs, different challenges were just coming up around housing. And so a lot of residents were going to have to determine if they could afford to continue living in the area, what different grant or options were available to help them in terms of support. And so really what this committee really focused on was identifying grants and other housing assistance opportunities to help provide information and assistance to local residents as they figured out what their next steps would be, what their short and long-term steps would be. So this group really focused on the enterprise grant is one example. That can be providing support to organizations for housing, construction, and repair. So that was the primary focus of the shelter and the housing group. And this enterprise grant, for example, really focused on construction, repairs, which included heat and hot water, lost revenue for very low-income housing developments, suffered disruption services, and direct resident assistance, as well as organizational working capital. So that was the focus of this group. And then James discussed some of the unique geography of the Rockaway, which has a pretty clear impact on the transportation system and the transportation options for the Rockaways. So one of the most devastating impacts of the storm was the A train that James mentioned, which really suffered extreme damage and really further geographically isolated the Rockaways. And so it really, figuring out how to address this challenge was one of the most crucial. The other aspects of the transportation system that were impacted would be the subway line to get to the airport and some of the local bus routes as well, especially because the subway itself doesn't cover the entire extent of the island. And so because of the severity of the damage, the subway service was suspended all the way until late May, I believe May 30th. And so coming up with alternatives was critical to this whole challenge. So 35,000 customers were really impacted by not being able to get the cleans, and then many of the Rockaway residents who are commuters into Manhattan were impacted. Another aspect of the transportation system is the Long Island Railroad, so that's another option to get between Queens and Manhattan. But the challenge there is that the Long Island Railroad has a separate fee that you have to pay, and so for many residents, that was just not a viable option financially to pay for your Long Island Railroad pass as well as your Metro pass. And so that was another challenge that was faced. So what our team did was trying to develop recommendations in the long term that could help address some of these transportation challenges, coming up with recommendations that looked at kind of unique alternatives. For example, there's something called the city ticket, which the MTA, the New York City Metropolitan Transit Authority, currently offers for weekends, where it's a reduced fare program for Long Island Railroad residents and for New York City Metro residents. So looking at unique alternatives to making transit more accessible in that sense is one of the recommendations that we looked at. The team also met with a local community board, and community boards are the most local form of government, and they have the responsibility of dealing with a lot of local services, and so those meetings are important to connect different stakeholder groups in developing long-term solutions. And so just moving forward, this just gives you a picture visually of one of the railroad tracks for the subway. But just looking ahead to one of the interesting transit options that came out of this challenge was the ferry service. So here you can see, I know it may be a little tough to read, but the Long Island Railroad's the light blue. If you look down at the bottom purple, the ferry is a really interesting transit option that was created after Sandy, and so that goes from Rockaways, you can see, all the way into Manhattan, and that became a very, very popular option. Rockaway did have a ferry service prior to Sandy, but I don't believe it was used as frequently as this ferry pathway has been, and there's a lot of demand. They've actually continued the service, extended it through Labor Day, and there are a lot of local residents advocating to keep it up permanently. So another solution that the transit system developed during Sandy was what's called the H shuttle, and that's the second one up from the bottom, that kind of light brown dot. And so basically what happened was a temporary extension of the subway was up and running within Rockaway, and that was that H shuttle. But that did not run at night. It only went in one direction, so there were a lot of challenges still remaining with the transit system. So that kind of encapsulates some of what was happening in terms of transportation.
Hilary, can you clarify real quick?
Sure.
Was it 2013 or 2014 that the subway was restored? May of 2013.
It was restored in 2013. May. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, we may have had a typo in there, but it was May of 2013. Yeah, it was a couple months ago. So it was about a 6-month lag until that was up and running. Are we good?
Yep, great.
Okay, so the mapping and support, great. The mapping and support team was really a good strategy that we put together in terms of these committees. The support team really was critical in developing some of the maps, especially that helped with our immediate strategies and long-term planning. As planners, I think we all understand the value of maps, so I won't spend too much time talking about this, but with the business survey and interview process, the market analysis that Mandu will get into, and just really understanding some of the land use opportunities and challenges in Rockaway, having a team dedicated to mapping and to technical needs was really, really important, and I think something that we took away as a really helpful and positive strategy that the team took on. And so then to move forward into the business outreach, just to put it a little bit more into context, originally this was the food access and business outreach. Some of the key grocery stores had been shut down after Sandy, and so food access was a critical need. But as the team's efforts really underwent, developed further, we realized that really we had to expand this to businesses in general, because that's where the real critical need was, more than specific to food. So we did provide some assistance in terms of there's some grant opportunities for food access that we were able to identify. New York City also has a unique zoning program. It's called the FRESH program, Food Retail Expansion to Support Health, I believe it stands for. And so one of the good things that's come out of Sandy was a local grocery store operator was funded through this grant program, through this FRESH program, which basically allows for grocery stores. It provides incentives for grocery stores to open up, particularly in industrial areas. But to get back out of that, we really honed in on this business work in particular. And so we really broke our work down into 2 phases. So the first phase was really identifying those immediate needs. And a lot of times people will say, well, you're planners, why are you focused so much on the businesses in the short term? but that was what the need was. I mean, to ask businesses long-term questions was completely impractical and just not realistic until we really were very focused on what we could do to support immediate needs and identified barriers to moving forward in long-term recovery efforts. And that's what phase 2 was. We really were not able to focus on long-term implementation and long-term planning, but to identify steps that RDRC and the Rockaway business community could take in the short term to build the foundation for the longer-term recovery, which would be a much larger process. And so as part of this effort, we did a few things. First, we started with a market analysis looking at the business community and the trends that were taking place in the Rockaways before Sandy struck, so we knew what the before and after scenarios were and could look like. And then the second piece, working very closely with RDRC for the structured interview process to really do a needs assessment for these local businesses. And that's what Mandu is going to get into in just a moment, along with the market analysis. And so that's primarily what our teams did, was we were facilitating and conducting and leading these interview teams. So with that, I'm going to pass the torch over to Mandu, who's going to jump into the pre-Sandy business context.
Thank you, Hilary. So, as Hilary mentioned, before looking at the results of the business interviews you conducted, it's worth taking a step and looking at the pre-Sandy context of the businesses in the Rockaways. The general estimate was that there were about 1,100 total businesses pre-Sandy, about a quarter of them were food and drink businesses, just to give you a sense of what type of businesses were there. Like a lot of New York City, many of these businesses were small businesses. James already talked about the socio-demographics of the Rockaways, so it's a mixed community, but there were a lot of low-income areas, and so businesses there were facing the kind of challenges you'd expect in low-income areas. Next. So the pre-Sandy business context. Looking back at the retail context really helps to illustrate just how much damage was done to the residents of the Rockaways by Sandy when as a result of a lot of business closure post-Sandy. So this chart shows demand in the Rockaways and supply and the retail gap pre-November 2012. So as we can see, demand far outstripped supply in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Only a quarter of the food and drink demand in the Rockaways was met within the Rockaways, for example. So what this means is that people had to leave the Rockaways to meet their needs. And when you remember the unique geography of the Rockaways, a long peninsula with not a lot of points of access, you realize what a challenge it is. And what happened post-Sandy when trains weren't working, cars got flooded and towed away, roads and bridge damaged. So basically, the business closings as a result of Sandy were exacerbating already a difficult situation in terms of business access, in terms of access to basic needs. Moving to the business interviews. So there are several things worth emphasizing before we talk about the business interviews we conducted. First of all, RDRC was our client, and we were going in there representing them. So this was both a check-in, so to speak, and a formal data gathering process. So whenever we, as teams of volunteers, visited the businesses, we introduced ourselves as volunteers for RDRC. Again, RDRC is the nickname of the acronym of the development corporation, was our client. Gave them material about RDRC, contact info, etc. We had to explain that we're not FEMA. That was sort of big. We're not FEMA. Secondly, instead of doing surveys where, from the beginning you need to get the sample size right, etc., we're all familiar with the process of conducting a proper survey. We went for structured interviews in key areas. Interviews are more flexible too, and generally I think post-recovery you're always sort of changing things. Things are always changing on the ground and you need to be adaptable. And conducting surveys is really hard. Interviews are more flexible. So looking at the 3 corridors we identified, RDRC identified 3 key economic corridors where they wanted to conduct the interviews. So going from right to left, the Rockaway Beach Boulevard, which is also the area where a lot of people go come visit in the summer to go to the beach. It's a very hip beach, and it's become in the last few years. Beach 116th Street and Beach 129th Street. Because the far Rockaway businesses, which is the area all the way to the right of the map, were not significantly damaged during Superstorm Sandy, they were lower priority, and interviews were not conducted in these areas. Moving on to the survey design. A series of qualitative and quantitative questions were developed, and the priority was to identify the short-term needs, understand how RDRC could assist the businesses in the recovery process. Long-term needs were really not addressed by the interview tool. It was not a priority of the business. It was not an immediate priority of RDRC. The question was how to deliver aid to the businesses in need. We ended up going out to the field beyond 4 interviews 3 times on December 8th, 2012, and January 5th and March 30th, 2013. These were all Saturdays because we were a team of volunteers, so we had to accommodate working folks' schedules. The interview form changed a bit as we sort of learned in the field. Initially, we were asking general questions regarding post-Sandy challenges, but we ended up drilling more on what kind of the kind of assistance we need the most. So the kind of questions we asked were basic information. Are you open? Are you closed? It wasn't always that easy to determine because sometimes, because we were there on the weekends, we might miss a business that was open during the week. Or a lot of businesses seemed open, but they were actually closed. So there was just a lot of activity and renovation going on. Identifying the greatest immediate needs, whether it's electricity, money, telephone, customers, etc. And finally, trying to understand how the businesses were negotiating the whole alphabet soup of aid agencies in the area and what kind of help could RDRC deliver in facilitating that process. So overall, we approached 297 businesses. Of those, 102 interviews were completed. Of the businesses we approached, 95 businesses were open for business, 135 businesses were closed, and the remaining 67 were undetermined. The status was undetermined. Again, we were only there on the weekend, so we weren't sure what was happening with some of those businesses during the week, whether they were open, partially open, etc. James had mentioned earlier that several months after Sandy, about 60% of the businesses were closed. We saw higher rates in the field when we were going out, businesses that were open, but one of the things to remember is that we were visiting business districts where, so the emphasis to open was foster where aid was concentrated, and so there are a lot of businesses scattered all over the Rockaway, so that's something to keep in mind. And we really had, these were business districts, general serving all sorts of needs, so there were various business types from restaurants to gift shops to pharmacies to gas stations, just what you'd expect. So, business interview results. The picture that emerged was pretty complicated, but there are several key takeaways. So, the first one was money. When we went out there and asked businesses, do you need help with renovations? Do you need help with any kind of specific physical need we thought was a priority, the first thing we said was, no, what we need is money. And one of the things they said almost exclusively was that there was strong preference to receiving grants over loans. Business owners simply did not want to go further into debt. Money was needed to address all areas of business operation, to compensate for lack of business, because they lost business over a lot of businesses lost business over the crucial Christmas season, to make up for loss of inventory, and of course to renovate the business. It's important to remember that the businesses we spoke to were either open or attempting to be open, so already dealing as best as they could with the physical aspects of post-Sandy recovery. So their concerns were really focused on the days and weeks and months ahead, making sure they can pay rent, that they can buy new stock, that they can make up the money that they had already sunk in renovations. The second key concern that many of the businesses cited as really important was customers. Businesses complained that the number of customers has dropped sharply, not only because of what you'd expect, because many residents had left the Rockaways as a result of Sandy, but also because many customers were simply not aware of businesses being open. You know, the perception was that the Rockaways was closed, the Rockaways wasn't working anymore, and they were really fighting to let people know that businesses were open. This is where the fact that we were zooming in on specific business clusters is important. Some business owners were really concerned about gap in the streetscape because, you know, you'd walk down the street and one business was open, even if it's still like looking a little disheveled, you know, not entirely finished fixing up, and the next business was clearly shut down and not clear whether renovations were ever going to happen. So they were really worried about how it would impact potential customers' perceptions of these areas, the attractiveness of the area overall, and really emphasize the need in terms of responding to disasters of reopening not just one or two critical businesses that might be a temptation, just, you know, such as a grocery store, pharmacy, but looking at a district all as a whole so that the businesses can sort of support each other and attract customers together. Looking at the physical infrastructure challenges, so while the main concerns were indeed money for various needs and customers, obviously physical infrastructure is a key issue. Depending on the area, many businesses were dealing with localized challenges, prolonged power loss as long as 2 or 3 months after Sandy, prolonged phone service loss. Some businesses suggested that many of the renovations were done in haste post-Sandy, so many businesses did not actually properly address issues such as mold. Maybe they were painting over a wall with mold or just plastering sheetrock on top of it without doing the proper difficult work that you need to do to get rid of mold, for example. And of course, thinking long-term, business owners just were under so much pressure that they could not afford to think of, wait, is this renovation even make sense for the location? Should we be doing something different in terms of construction to meet the next Superstorm Sandy? This was just something that they did not have time to think about. And it actually did not come up as a result of an interview with our interviews. It was something that the fact that it did not come up is significant. Of course, both issues, both the issue of quality of renovations and whether these renovations were up to standard, to a new standard for preparedness for the next disaster, are issues that homeowners face as well. Finally, business interviews raised two additional issues. First of all, who was supporting the businesses? Who was actually giving money to the businesses and other kinds of support? very few businesses we interviewed reported receiving any financial aid from the government. Renovations were almost exclusively done out of the business owner's pocket or through informal loans, etc. Occasionally, there was an exception in the case of franchises or chains. Verizon, for example, helped franchisees renovate, gave them some money to renovate. Just as an example of how hard it was for smaller businesses. In one case, a business owner had applied for aid, but his application was rejected because his financial situation was not good enough to qualify for a Sandy recovery loan. This was a liquor store, and they tend to hold massive amounts of inventory, and he lost almost $1 million worth of inventory. And in order to start operating again, he basically had to borrow right and left in order to restock, and he claims that that disqualified him from getting certain loans. So that's the kind of situation they were dealing with. Another big complaint, another issue that emerged was the bureaucratic hurdles businesses were facing. For one thing, to fill in the various applications, businesses had to fill in very lengthy documentation that might have been destroyed during Sandy, or maybe they were just too busy, business owners may be too busy to take the time to focus on filling it in. They needed help. In some cases, it took months for businesses to hear back from relevant agencies. We kept on hearing, oh, we applied a month ago, but we never heard back. Not surprisingly, business owners reported a general sense of support services being overwhelmed or not really there for them. They reported a general sense of lack of coordination. They didn't really understand who was supposed to help them, how was that supposed to work. There were other bureaucratic hurdles that were more specific. In a certain area, we heard a repeated complaint from multiple businesses that they were being issued fines for things like incorrect signage by New York City's Department of Consumer Affairs, and that was even before businesses had reopened. In one case, the store owner, who was still, the store was still closed, was issued a $900 fine for an incorrect sign. He actually went ahead and appealed the fine. And what you see in that photo on the slide is actually the whole paperwork we filled and in order to appeal the sign. And he went along and appealed it, and he won his appeal. The fine was canceled. But you have to wonder, here's a business owner struggling to reopen post-Sandy, and he's spending a lot of time appealing a fine for not for a health issue, not for a hazard, but for incorrect signage. So is this the correct priority of city resources? Is this the correct use of the time of a business owner who's still dealing with a business that's still shut down months and months post-Sandy? So these are the kind of issues we encountered when we went out to the area and interviewed businesses. Erin?
Great, thank you, Mandu. So I'm just going to walk through a few of the recommendations from the report touching on each of the different areas that we've covered so far. And while the project and our effort was designed primarily to serve RDRC and help them tackle and address the challenges facing the Rockaway business community, we also saw this as an opportunity for the Metro chapter to learn from the experience and provide some lessons and recommendations that we hope can prove useful to other groups dealing with similar issues down the road. So first, under shelter and housing, although RDRC doesn't provide housing, they aim to preserve the quality of housing throughout the Rockaways through promoting and preserving housing for low and moderate income individuals and families through a variety of training and counseling programs. They have a first-time homebuyer certificate training session that's certified by HUD, and they offer foreclosure prevention counseling. So as Hilary mentioned earlier, the team had identified the Enterprise Grant and Loan Program as a possible fit to support their housing work in the wake of Sandy. And we also recommended that RDRC explore a partnership with the Center for New York City Neighborhoods to bolster their foreclosure prevention services. We also talked earlier about transportation and the city ticket program and how important that was to the Rockaway business community in terms of accessibility of transportation, and not necessarily in the immediate aftermath of the storm because of the closures on the railroad system, but even going forward long term, this would be a more affordable and more accessible way that could open up the business community when other options may not be available down the road. We also recommended that RDRC establish a working relationship with the community board to address future transportation needs. And in terms of business outreach, this was really the bulk of our efforts and recommendations were focused on the business services. So as Mandu just described, the interview results really indicated that the principal needs of businesses in the period following the storm were for funding and for better clarity on how to negotiate and navigate the applications for post-Sandy aid. So our team members conducted research on some of the best practices in business recovery assistance, and one of the commonly identified effective solutions was a mobile assistance unit. So drawing on this research and our assessment of the business needs in the community, we felt this mobile unit would be a useful tool and a helpful resource for RDRC and the businesses. This slide here shows some of the findings from our best practices research. This is recommendations taken from restoreyoureconomy.org. You can see at the bottom of the slide. And there's a number of steps and components that are recommended here, and we framed our recommendations around some of these. First, identifying and seeking funding to establish the mobile unit, and we recommended and provided some guidance to RDRC on applying for discretionary funding from the New York City Council or different foundations or banks. Second, to work with local partners to develop a marketing and promotional campaign to advertise the mobile unit, and then a hotline to field inquiries and provide quick and easy access to information for some of the local businesses. As far as the other lessons learned, we grouped them into several different categories. The next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is some of the lessons learned and what we hope will be useful for our team and for other teams going forward down the road. Sandy, as we all know, was an unprecedented storm, and many of the agencies and partners in this region had little to no experience dealing with a storm of this magnitude and the resulting damage and devastation. So naturally, with a storm this severe, the pressure to act quickly was great, and our team jumped to action, and so did many, many others. Looking back on the storm and the work of RDRC and our volunteer team, we tried to assess what worked and what didn't. There's lessons, on both sides of that. So over the next couple slides, I'm just going to go through some of what we learned, and we hope will provide useful to any of us. Sorry, go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So under planning and project management, just a few quick points. But first, it's important to understand the client and the capacity and skills of the volunteer team. So that would help define the scope of work and ensure realistic goals and targets, as well as to help assign tasks and roles to the appropriate people so that we can take advantage of their particular skills. In a disaster situation especially, the needs are so many and so great, it's difficult for one group to tackle them all. So it's important to kind of tightly manage the expectations and help everyone understand what their different roles are and what the project aims to achieve. With any group project, it's important to have a designated leader or a manager, and this person could help monitor and evaluate the scope of work. For example, as we talked about earlier, determining whether the intent is for immediate relief or sort of mid-term, longer-term recovery work. And then the leader could also serve as a primary liaison with the client so that you don't have many different groups or people trying to communicate and working at sort of cross purposes. And then lastly, communications are really important. As I'm sure we all know, group communication can be really difficult, and having a plan at the beginning would be helpful to facilitate better communication and quicker flow of work. So this communication plan would maybe touch on the frequency of calls or meetings, methods for communicating, and designated points of contact. Next slide, please. So in terms of information gathering, Mandu touched on this a little bit with the questionnaires, interviews, and surveys. But we wanted to there were several purposes for our interviews, both to touch base with the businesses, take stock, take inventory of which were closed and which were open, but then also to identify their immediate pressing needs. So to do this, it's important to understand what information you're trying to obtain. And gathering good usable information or data takes work. And these are just some of the lessons that we learned in this process in no particular order. But first, identifying what it is that you're trying to answer. Being specific, concise, objective, and always remembering the purpose of the data gathering. It's also helpful to test surveys and or interview questions in advance. If you have a team of volunteers, maybe try to give them copies of the questions ahead of time so that they can practice and become familiar with the questions, and then be able to answer questions about them when they're out in the community talking with the business owners, for example. It's also important to avoid leading respondents to certain answers or making assumptions about what they know. And we also suggested, like I said, training the volunteers, and providing identification was also important. Just in terms of having so many different groups out in the community at once, there were lots of organizations that were working to help in this neighborhood, and it was, I think, hard sometimes for the business owners to keep track of who was who, and they felt maybe they'd already answered that question. So just to avoid duplication of work, it would be good to try to identify who's who and then maybe even coordinate those efforts going forward to share information that's being gathered. And then being sensitive to the challenges of the participants. A lot of these business owners were just really kind of reeling from the storm still and trying to deal with putting their lives and their businesses back together. So it was difficult for them to think about, you know, months or even years down the road. And initially, some of what we had hoped to gather in terms of information was about long-term rebuilding plan. But it just wasn't feasible for them to think at that level or that time frame when they were dealing with this immediate needs. So just taking that into consideration when you're figuring out what questions it is that you'd like to ask. And also we learned that funding identification is really important as well, because as Mandu mentioned, the money, money, money was one of the one of the common answers that they presented as their immediate need. So if there was any way to, as part of a information gathering process, to collect information about what funding opportunities businesses or agencies like RDRC might be able to tap into immediately to kind of as a stopgap until some of the longer-term recovery funds became available. So these might be funds to assist with assessment or immediate cleanup and repair. Next. Thank you. Bigger picture post-disaster planning in general. It's important to, sorry about that. So as I touched on earlier with a group like APA, it's important to differentiate the types of work that a group is doing, whether it's short-term or long-term rebuilding strategies. And in some cases it might be both, but in our experience there was a high demand for some of the immediate relief, and at least initially, like I just said, a lack of interest or ability to think about some of the longer-term recovery work. So that's part of defining the scope of the work. We also recommend thinking about identifying different partners and the system to track and coordinate efforts. So I mentioned previously that there were so many different groups in the area conducting different surveys or trying to get different information. And in hindsight, it would have been great if we'd been able to have someone focused on trying to understand what those different groups were doing and what information they were gathering so that we could all learn from one another, or at least avoid asking the same questions over and over again. And in terms of funding, as people were asking about what resources they could tap into and different organizations were trying to assess what monies were available for assisting businesses, it's important to remember that having clear goals, objectives, and measurable outcomes is important so that the funders can understand what the impact of their funding will be. In other words, what is going to be the impact or what difference their financial support is going to make. And then planning now for later, it's a hard thing to do for many people. It's very common in the planning field to have to work hard to get people to think long-term down the road. But many of the businesses we encountered and spoke with didn't have a plan in place for what happens in case of an emergency. And so if there's any one of the next steps that might be worth looking into is what are the protocols and what can businesses do to ensure that they are prepared for next time, and do they have a plan in place for how to recover, how to come back, and contacts for who to work with in the case of future disasters. Looking ahead, just these are some thoughts about some of the future efforts with the New York Metro Chapter team, as well as throughout the region and going forward, building on the work that was started as part of this project. Recovery efforts should tie into long-term resiliency planning efforts for the region. As with many planning projects, it doesn't make sense to do so in isolation, so planning should build on and take into consideration the broader context of what's being done at the various levels, whether that's local, New York City, metropolitan region, state, throughout the tri-state region. And then exploring partnerships for rebuilding, for design, for long-term planning strategies. There's a number of groups that are involved in these types of activities, whether they are professional organizations, colleges or universities, and there's a lot of talent out there that can be taken advantage of. Along a similar line, taking advantage of existing programs that may not be specifically disaster-oriented, but could be used to help facilitate rebuilding and long-term planning. There are a number of state and local programs or federal programs that aren't specifically oriented toward disaster planning or recovery, but can assist. Hilary mentioned earlier the FRESH program that helped the Key Food Store and Rockaways, and other programs such as brownfield redevelopment funding or environmental programs may also be tapped to assist with rebuilding going forward, as well as funding from maybe slightly less likely suspects. Corporate foundations or banks or even insurance companies may have programs that could be used. And then just to reiterate again, building on previous planning efforts and comprehensive planning that's going on in this area as well as the surrounding area to make sure that disaster-specific issues are being addressed as well as more traditional planning related issues. So those are just a few thoughts about looking forward, and then I'm going to turn it over to James, who's going to provide a few final thoughts.
Thanks, Erin. Just to let everyone know, and actually it does put the storm and the effort into context for everyone. Unfortunately, Kevin Alexander, the Executive Director of RDRC, won't be joining us today because he has a structural roof issue, which they discovered today, and they're pretty certain it's storm-related. So just to give you an idea, we're in July, mid-July already. The storm happened in October, and folks are still dealing with issues even after reports have been released, initial recovery efforts have gone by the wayside, and there's efforts already beginning to start to talk about resiliency. So just, if you pray, keep Kevin and RDRC in your prayers to make sure that, he gets through it, because RDRC is the largest community development corporation in the Rockaways. And if he has to struggle to relocate, that provides more difficulty for the residents and local businesses to find assistance, find guidance towards necessary goods and services and grants and loans. But in general, I just want to talk a little bit about the experience itself very quickly and just what we're doing in terms of next steps. First, as a chapter president, I was very proud of the effort that our Economic Development Committee, who led the charge on this, of which all the panelists today are a part of, and it's led by Chisato Shimada and Anthony Drummond for our co-chairs. Put hundreds and hundreds of hours of effort into this. We felt that planning needed to take a role in the recovery and resiliency process, and that it went beyond basic, what people basically feel are the roles of planners. That we found there was a medium-term need to address economic development, to address basic goods and services where planners could play a role and set up the framework for next steps to occur. We've been in a number of conversations with different groups ranging from various levels of government, the city's special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency, to the New York State Department of State, to FEMA, to reaching out to municipalities on Long Island and other government agency offices, to working with groups like Occupy Sandy, who have a presence in the Rockaways, Coney Island, and Staten Island. They've been doing a lot of the groundwork, and they should really be commended for their effort. But also working with other professional organizations such as AIA, ASLA, the Regional Plan Association, groups like that, because it's developing these partnerships and thinking regionally is really the way we're going to be able to recover properly. And I also have to acknowledge the work that the APA New Jersey chapter has done. Chuck Latini and Sheena Collum, they've been wonderful partners. We've been sharing information because the efforts and the work that we put in here isn't just a solo effort. It's just working with a number of groups to address the needs, because even though for a lot of people, for individuals, recovery is local, it's not going to succeed unless we can all pool our resources together and focus on a way to get this done. Those of you who know New York City is a very tough place to get certain things done. There are a lot of competing interests, amongst planners, architects, engineers, and most importantly, developers and banks who are looking, just to make their mark and make their footprint here. So it's been a wonderful experience working with our members on this report and with RDRC. APA National has played a role in all of this. They've assisted in hosting a series of workshops throughout New York and New Jersey to address the needs with a highlight on the Rockaways. There has been discussion of a community plan assistance team, CPAT team, which is the conversation is still ongoing, but it's not a CPAT team, just working with the national chapter to leverage and pool together resources to better assist Kevin and RDRC and other like organizations in the Rockaways to identify opportunities such as grants and loans and just help better position them into the conversation. As was mentioned a few times, there are a number of groups out there, and they have certain partnerships, while RDRC has certain partnerships with local elected officials, APA groups, and just trying to make sure those connections are made so there are not duplicative services. One thing that has been noted many a times is that there's workshop fatigue. And that's why it's extremely important to coordinate, because APA might be hosting a series of workshops for residents, and then AIA comes in with a partnership with SBS to do a series of workshops, and then Pratt Institute and another school comes in and does a series of workshops. So communication is extremely important. And that's a role that APA can play and has played in this process, is just making sure that the local groups are connected with one another and just leveraging the resources from APA National on that. Again, on the note of communication, it's really crucial to get neighborhoods to talk to each other. We were lucky enough, which one of our executive committee members called it nothing short of a miracle, to get a foot in the door into Breezy Point. For those who don't know, Breezy Point is a private land cooperative whose residents are primarily uniformed service workers, cops, firemen, sanitation workers, some Secret Service workers, groups like that who are a very provincial community. And so for an opportunity for us to get into there to explain, what APA is doing, what RDRC is doing, just so there's communication happening is not only a benefit to groups like RDRC, but it's a benefit to Breezy Point so that they don't feel isolated in the process. And Breezy Point is a very isolated community as it's completely surrounded by Jacob Riis Park and the Gateway National Recreation Area. So it's just making sure that groups are on the same page. As a private land cooperative, Breezy Point can essentially do what they want in terms of resiliency efforts. But if they're unaware that their efforts to build, say, a 6-foot dune wall while Breezy Point only builds a 3.5-foot dune wall, guess what? Water is being pushed from those 6-foot dune walls down to the 3.5-foot dune wall to where Breezy Point is. And so it's important for them and all groups to know exactly what's going on and keeping them up to date. It's also incumbent upon us to help RDRC and other groups to identify new opportunities and resources. A lot of CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funding, has come out. We have been trying to keep groups abreast of what's going on with that, just so they know where funding is and where access is to funding, so they can go out to their businesses and residents to let them know that the money is flowing. Also, it's better utilizing our relationship with the local planning schools. I had mentioned Pratt, but also NYU had been working with Ron Schiffman, who's at Pratt. Hunter did a few studios in Hoboken, New Jersey, and Staten Island, and Columbia, the Urban Real Estate Center there, has been very active in the Hurricane Sandy process. But it's just really, as I mentioned, just making sure that we can utilize opportunities, we can utilize knowledge and the resources of the universities for that. And finally, just APA as an organization as a whole has an excellent relationship with the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And from an educational and a resource standpoint, they have been wonderful partners. The General Counsel, Rob DeVos, has been out to the Rockaways a number of times, has been out to Brooklyn to assess the area, and they've put together a variety of workshops over the time, both aimed at professionals and not-for-profits to help dissipate the message. And they have been having an ongoing dialogue with us. So it's exploring those relationships, and not necessarily just with the Dutch, but with potentially other countries and other states who deal with it. So if other hurricane-prone areas have information, we're more than welcome and open to hear it. A former chapter member who's down in Mississippi, who did significant work down there, was a very helpful resource for us. And so we utilized that knowledge into the process. And essentially just, making sure that planning is discussed, that planning is relevant to the conversation. As I mentioned, that it's New York, there's a lot of jockeying going on, and so just making sure that sound, sustainable planning is an important part of the conversation. So I know we're running out of time, so we want to give an opportunity to at least ask a few questions. But thank you for participating. And this is our information, nyplanning.org. You could watch the New York One piece that occurred in late November, December, and this is our address. And any questions, you can reach us at office@nyplanning.org. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you, James. The first question comes in from Mohsen. Logistically speaking, how did you manage to prioritize the short-term activities and keep midterm and long-term folks out of the way in early days of the event?
Well, I think everyone had a sense of that, we can't, dive bomb into communities and, just start planning. We're really not we've learned a lot over the last few months, but, are still learning how other states and regions work. But this is something that New York and New Jersey had never experienced before. When this happened, last year was Tropical Storm, or in 2011, Tropical Storm Irene. It affected primarily the middle and upper Hudson valleys and Vermont, so we read a lot about it. So a lot of folks didn't really hunker down and take Sandy seriously because they figured it would be exactly like Irene. And so we really just didn't exactly know what to do immediately. So the idea of long-term planning and just medium-term efforts just really was not on the radar, except for a few of us. APA, we were working like, how can we position ourselves? It's like the first month we had said we can't really get involved now because people are trying to get the lights on. They're trying to get phone service. They're trying to get heating oil, gas, things like that. So I think there was a sense of we recognize a lot needs to happen, so let's take a step back, let the emergency responders handle it. And then after a month or so, then we can really start implementing the role of planners and other professional organizations into the conversation. I don't know if anyone else has comments.
Just to add to that, as the volunteers were doing these interviews, you just couldn't ask those questions. People just were not mentally ready to answer them. So I personally was not on the interview team, but just hearing the stories of those who were, the needs were so immediate. It was mode that people were not ready for that. So it just sort of naturally tightened our expectations and honed in on how can we help develop immediate assistance. So that really played a large role.
All right, great. Next question comes in from Michael. Would the Rockaways benefit from a development corporation modeled after the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation post 9/11 that would be charged with securing and administering federal and state funds in a transparent, efficient, and equitable manner?
Well, technically, RDRC is in a position to apply for and access those type of funds, but the one major issue with the way New York City is run is there is a disparity in not only with income, race, class, whatever you want to call it, but just in terms of energy. The Rockaways, while it received a lot of attention, was a very feel-good kind of effort for a lot of folks. Whereas the devastation after 9/11 occurred, there were more vested, vital invested, moneyed interest into getting Lower Manhattan back up and running. And so there was a very, very big effort to have a central focus. Also, the Rockaways are just one of many communities devastated by this. And so the mayor's office, to a large extent, created the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, SIRR, which kind of consolidated all that under the mayor's office in developing a report and working with specific organizations and firms to come up with a plan, to come up with a strategy for funding relief. I would agree that it is, a group like RDRC should be bolstered as opposed to forming a new organization. They've had an extensive history there. So it's, instead of reinventing the wheel and bringing someone from the outside in, we should be looking at our existing community development corporations and looking for a way to best help them.
All right, this question comes in from Jeremiah. What are the steps being taken now to limit redevelopment in those areas that were shown to be the most impacted by the storm, i.e. those most at risk to such storm events?
I would say that's an ongoing conversation, and if anyone else wants to chime in, is that's still really being assessed right now. A lot of people don't want to leave. That's the obstacle, but at the same time, that's the crux of helping our communities recover. to date, within New York City's boundaries, there's only one community that I know of that has voluntarily said, you know, our neighborhood was devastated. We shouldn't live here. If the city wants to buy us out, we're more than happy to listen. And that neighborhood was Oakwood Beach in Staten Island, an area that I've had the opportunity to tour. And we're talking about homes that were built, you know, wedged into marshland, you know, decent homes, nice homes, but wedged into marshland and just along inlets, really where there never should have been development. And once, you know, 4 months later, when their homes are still sitting at a 45-degree angle and some homes simply floated away, the community came together as a community of 165 homeowners, and 130 of them signed a petition to say, if the city wants to buy us out, we're willing to listen. There are other places in Staten Island we could move. You know, both fortunately for neighborhood context and unfortunately in terms of, you know, strategizing for resiliency, you know, not a lot of neighborhoods and not a lot of towns have the same mindset as of yet. I just think as we get along, as rising costs, as difficulty to get insurance comes along, then, you know, we'll find people and just, you know, more opportunities for that. But one thing I mentioned the Dutch, they've been helpful, is identifying, you know, creative strategies, how to build not only infrastructure, but build, you know, around neighborhoods to address immediate needs and causes, while in the long term you solve those issues of, you know, whether we should buy people out. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
Yes, this is Mandu. Well, while New York State has officially announced a sort of relocation program, New York City and its recently published resiliency report for the area of the Rockaways doesn't mention relocation as a target. Another thing to remember about the Rockaways, it's actually fairly densely populated. So you're compared to, say, some areas of the Jersey Shore or even Staten Island, sort of on a relative scale, or certain areas of the Rockaways are fairly densely populated. So that's something to keep in mind. And the Community Development Block Grant Program is just getting launched, and that's going to engage a whole planning process related to that. And at least in theory, relocations are part of the agenda, but only part of the agenda.
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, our next question comes in from Stuart. What was the role of the New York City Planning Department and related city agencies?
That's a varied answer, I would say. City planning played a big role in the process, particularly most notably Howard Slatkin and Mike Morella. Mike, who's a former chapter executive committee member, has been in charge of the waterfront revitalization program and the updated amendments as well. They did play a role. They were very crucial to the SIRR process. But one thing that we heard from many agencies is that it was a very top-down setup, and the agencies were kind of on a need-to-know basis. So once the various committees and leadership of the SIR process were ready to involve agencies at certain standpoints, that's when they became involved. But in terms of actual product, there were text amendments to the waterfront revitalization program. My office is currently reviewing and about to issue comments for the department's flood resiliency text amendment program, which is working to lax zoning regulations in coastal areas and implement different types of regulations, laxing in the sense of, there are certain height restrictions in more low-rise areas and where to build and where to articulate FAR, so in order to compensate for lost floor area through the need to build higher, the need to remove any certain types of uses below 6 or 8 feet above base sea level, and trying to design homes according to flood level as opposed to base sea level. And other streetscape initiatives, requiring that even though you're going to be talking about raising homes, including, active streetscape design guidelines and, potential glazing, just so it doesn't look like a dead street wall, adding, lower level porches, just, to give that opportunity. So they have been very involved in the process.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to all our presenters and all of our attendees for attending today's event. I'm going to go through a few reminders on how to log your CM credits for attending today's event and where you can find a recording of the webcast today in just a moment. So here I will switch it back over, and thank you again to the presenters, Erin, James, Mandu, Hilary. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so for those of you who are still in attendance, to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM, select today's date, which is Friday, July 19th, and then select today's webcast, which is Getting Back to Business, addressing the needs of Rockaway businesses impacted by Superstorm Sandy. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. Also, we are recording today's session, so you will be able to find a recording of this webcast on our YouTube channel later today. This does conclude today's session. I want to thank everyone again for attending.